My name's Boyda. Got it. So try not to press the button that boots you out of the meeting. I'm Boyda, pronouns she, her. I'm with Rank and File Action at CUNY, part of the Professional Staff Congress. I told everyone to maybe try to change their names, Zoom names, to reflect their pronouns in union, but it seems like this Zoom account maybe doesn't allow that. So it's great to see some of you introducing yourselves in the chat. And I am really pleased to be facilitating the second event of the Breaking Unjust Laws series, which is part of a collaboration that we've been fostering between RAFA, Rank and File Action, and Member Action Coalition, or MAC, at the SUNY schools, which is a great dissident caucus pushing UUP to become even more radical and represent its members. And so RAFA and MAC are really learning from each other, and it's a great kind of conversation to facilitate. And so tonight, so the first event, thank you all for coming. The first event of this series was in November, and it was about breaking anti-strike laws, such as the Taylor Law that we're facing as public sector workers here in New York State. And there's a video, I'll just drop the link in the chat. If you missed it, please, I invite you to watch at least the presentation portion of that event, which is really exciting, and just reminds us that we don't need to feel like we have to follow these laws, and that the only way to overturn the Taylor Law is to break it, at least right now. And so tonight we have, the theme is censorship, and we have two speakers. Just like last time, we're gonna have, we'll start with the presentations, and then we should have lots of time after the presentations for Q&A. So, get your pen ready, take notes, and we really look forward to a robust discussion. And we have two, and especially in terms of things that we might take for granted being in New York, but that might be sort of on the horizon for us. I think we're all really looking forward to learning from these speakers tonight. So without further ado, I'll introduce the first speaker, which is Mary Graham Hunter, a youth librarian at the Ferndale Area District Library. She's a member of the Michigan Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Task Force and conducts anti-censorship training for frontline library workers. She was a member of the organizing committee for the Ferndale Library Workers Union, affiliated with the Newspaper Guild of Detroit, which will shortly begin bargaining their first contract. So please join me in welcoming Mary Graham. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's so good to be here, and I love that we get to do some cross-state work. I mostly hang out with other Michiganders. So the Ferndale Library, Ferndale is a suburb immediately north of Detroit. It's just 1 mile north of the Detroit border. So I live in Detroit. I'm a lifelong Detroiter, but I work in this fairly kind of posh, bougie, liberal-leaning suburb that I think is one of those places that wants to tell itself it can never happen here, but it absolutely can. Oh, thank you to the person in the chat that says healing energies to Michigan State. That has been very, very difficult here the past week, especially because there's a high school in the same county as my library that had a mass shooting less than a year and a half ago, and some of those kids now go to Michigan State. So we are reeling does not begin to cover it. So thank you very much for the good wishes. So Ferndale is the sort of a community that likes to think that book challenges, censorship kind of could never happen there, except it's happening all around us. And we also, this is a very concentrated Roman Catholic area, including far right Roman Catholics and Roman Catholic organizations. So that is frankly where I expect our problems to come from. They've already sponsored Hide the Pride kind of campaigns where during Pride Month, all the Pride Month displays get checked out, which of course looks great on the circulation stats if we ever get them back. So that's the kind of thing that I have in mind when we do kind of the defensive preparation that we're currently doing at my library. We revised our request for reconsideration of materials form about 6 months ago. So it's now a 3 to 4 page book report. That means that if anybody wants to, say like, oh, I don't think this material, this article in the collection should be here, they have to do quite a lot of homework. And if they leave any part of the form blank, we throw it out. And it says so right at the top of the form. Because if you're gonna decide you want something pulled, you're gonna have to tell us why you can do our job better than we can. And I mean, so far, my library in particular hasn't had to, no one's turned that form in. But this is all very much at the front of our minds, so much so that we organized a union. So the Ferndale Library is a district library. We're not a city department. And that reorganization happened, I think, about 15 years ago. And when the library was a city department, I'm pretty sure they were AFSCME, they were the same union as the rest of the city employees. And when they reorganized as an independent district library, they just never picked another union. So we've been ununionized for quite some time, and it's really starting to make a lot of people nervous. I mean, as though the pandemic wasn't bad enough, getting, all of this news about censorship from left, right, and center, and being afraid for job security, because that's one of the things that makes it difficult to break those unjust laws, is like, however much you might want to, if you're gonna lose your home, or you're gonna be really hungry if your job goes somewhere because you get fired, like that's not a trivial concern. And so a lot of us were like, well, without a union, we're crossing our fingers. So we're affiliated with the Newspaper Guild, specifically the News Guild of Detroit, and are hopefully going to start bargaining our first contract next week. So we haven't gotten into the nitty gritty of specific, demands that are going to protect us from censorship actions specifically. But the whole campaign was undertaken very much in the vein of, you gotta have a plunger before you need a plunger, right? Like if somebody comes into my library and kicks up a fuss, so I'm a youth librarian and I'm in charge of all of the nonfiction books, which means I buy all the sex and gender books for children aged 0 to 14 or so, because YA is a separate section. And we have a lot of books that are geared for children under 14. They're like pretty explicit about sex and where babies come from, because a lot of children under 14 like want to know what sex is. And there's a lot of developmentally appropriate material out there for them. And also, if they go to the teen section or the adult section and check out the books there, that is also their business. We have intellectual freedom, at least for now. And it's a public library, I don't get to police what they check out. So I feel like I very much would be one of the selectors in the crosshairs of if we ever had a complaint about like, oh, you're peddling pornography to children, which is not what any librarian is doing, but that's what gets thrown around. And so knowing like, okay, I'm not an at-will employee, I have a contract, I have a director who is very pro intellectual freedom, who would have my back, but nobody stays in their job forever. So, if the board decides that they don't like me that much, or if I have a different director, if I'm union, I can't just be tossed out because they don't like me anymore. And so, 90% of my coworkers also decided that sounded like a good deal, and we won our union election 18-2. So that's about the state of things. Like the introduction that Boyda read said, I work on a state task force about intellectual freedom. So mostly just what that means is whenever a library in Michigan gets some kind of challenge, whether it's formal or not, they can call us up. Mostly they use us for moral support. We do also provide financial support. If it's a small library that doesn't actually have the money to retain a lawyer, we can get them that money. But they call us up and they, can get advice or just have people say, God, that's awful. No one should be speaking to you like that at your job. And then also when people sort of put out calls for, hey, can someone come train us? I'm usually the person in Southeast Michigan who gets that kind of bat signal. And so I've gotten to go and do some cool presentations for like, the person sitting at the circulation desk, the person sitting at the reference desk, what happens if somebody comes in with a book and they're mad? And how do you diffuse that? And basically like that's what we have directors for. Like, that's what managers are for. You pass that up the chain, and if someone is rude to you on the phone, click. Like, we hang up at Ferndale. We live in a society. You can call back when you can be nice to the person at the front desk. So that's kind of the state of things in Michigan, but it is gnarly in other parts of the state. A lot of you have probably heard about the Patmos Library in Jamestown, which has gotten a lot of national attention because they've now had their millage rejected twice over the queer books that are in their library collection. And there, at some point, there is only so much you can do, and their governing board is displaying a tremendous amount of moral courage because they're absolutely refusing to take those books off of the shelves because they belong there. But at the same time, they're paying a very steep price.
Wow, thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's always inspiring to hear from librarians and just like the courage that you have to express in the face of a lot of confusion around what it means to have and express intellectual freedom, especially around these issues of gender and sexuality. So it's really inspiring to hear about what you've faced in Detroit or south of Detroit. So hopefully we can put sort of that context in conversation with our next speaker. And I know a lot of us have been watching on the news what's happening in Florida in terms of the DeSantis kind of push against a lot of, you know, things that are basically like white supremacist laws. So I think we're going to hear from Katie from Florida Higher Education, who's going to share on the current struggle at Florida that Florida educators are facing against attacks on academic freedom and extreme censorship. And we're going to hear her discuss attempts to organize in her local union and in coalition with student groups.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm sure you've probably all heard of the Stop Woke Act, right? This prohibits educators from endorsing 8 kinds of prohibited content related to race and gender, such as, you know, you can't say that an individual is either oppressed or privileged based on their race. And so when this law went into effect, at my campus, like on other campuses, a form was put up where students could report faculty for violating their individual freedom by teaching these prohibited concepts. However, at the same time, the administration began offering courses in which they told us, we don't want you to kind of completely cut out that content, but we also don't want you to endorse it. So here's some ways that you can, you know, discuss the content in class without endorsing it. And so there was a series of classes run through the teaching center on campus that, you know, taught us how to kind of reframe our curriculum. We were also encouraged to put lines in our syllabi saying, you know, this instruction is not meant to compel you to believe anything. And then there was the response of our statewide union. Our statewide union, they basically told us, look, like the best way to fight this is collectively. Let's fight this at the ballot box. Let's, you know, also fight this in the courses. But they're like, but you as individuals need to make decisions based on how much, you know, risk you're comfortable with. And those that wish to work in a low risk environment, you should cut instruction about race and gender from your teaching and take down any posters or artwork in your office that might conflict with the act. The medium risk, you know, those of us that were medium risk were instructed to do essentially what the administration said and kind of reframe our content just to make it clear that we're just, you know, talking about these ideas, but we're not endorsing them. And then they said, you know, for faculty that are high risk, just kind of continue to teach as you'd like. So some of us in our union, were troubled by both the approach of the administration as well as the approach of the statewide union. We felt like as a union, we needed, and as educators, like this content was way too critical to cut out of our curriculum, and our students needed to hear it. And we also, academic freedom is guaranteed to us by our collective bargaining agreement. And so we weren't ready just to kind of change our curriculum. But at the same time, we thought that people would feel more comfortable in this environment continuing to teach if they knew that others were doing so, and that others had their back in the event that they were disciplined. So we decided to try to organize. This started off with a series of organizing meetings. The administration, they were having kind of 6 meetings on how to kind of, modify course content to be in compliance with HB 7. So, or the Stop Woke Act. We decided to have 6 meetings where we would invite people into a space to think about how can we resist? What can we do about this? And so we got about 100 people from the 1,400 or so in our bargaining unit show up to this first series of meetings. And then from that, we tried to build out a campaign. Basically, we were asking people to sign a petition saying that they were going to maintain academic freedom in their classroom, and also that if anyone was disciplined, they would respond to the call to go out and protest. We also held a teach-in on campus in coalition with some student groups. And so, yeah, our basic goals were, we knew we didn't have the power to get this law taken off the books, but we thought that we did have the power to kind of impact the extent to which it shaped teaching on our campus. But our campaign, it wasn't tremendously successful. I think only about like a little over 100 faculty ended up signing on to our petition, and turnout at the teach-in, wasn't what we hoped. There's a couple parts, but we had probably 100 students and maybe like 50 to 60 faculty go to the 2 parts. And I think there's reasons for our lack of success. The first was, the union was very weak going into this, and there was no kind of representative structure. We didn't have a steward structure. So it was really hard to mobilize and organize people. Also, like in our post-pandemic workplace, many people just have not returned to campus. The cost of living here is very expensive. So many are trying to kind of continue to live remotely. And also I think there was just a lack of people that were able to step up and take on a leadership role in this. And so those of us that did were spread pretty thin. So Stop Woke is now enjoined, but we're still, of course, facing a lot of political interference on our campuses, including a struggle over the civics curriculum that's being rolled out. Like civics centers are being established at different universities, as well as the takeover of New College. And so, where to go from here? I think, well, very clearly, I think we need to be organizing in coalition with students. Some students at another Florida university had a great slogan, which was "Let us learn." And so I think that's really important, foregrounding student voices. I also think that we need to work on framing. I think the messaging needs to be about the right doesn't want us talking about race and gender so they can maintain social inequality. We as educators are, interested in a more equal world. And, we believe in education as a public good, and we believe in fully funding public education. So I think that this is the sort of framing work that needs to happen. And so we've talked about building out what we would call, after the University of Florida had a free US coalition, and we talked about kind of mobilizing kind of around two broad points. One would be freedom from political interference of the state legislature, and the second is freedom to teach and learn, which would also, you know, include demands for COLA for all campus workers, you know, include, you know, demands about making education more accessible. But we're still not very well organized. There's not many people with very much social movement experience. And I think we're struggling to plan effective actions and to be able to kind of develop the capacity to turn out a lot of people. I think that the students have planned a protest on campus on Thursday. The unions actually signed on to endorse them, and we're also kind of circulating the information about this protest along with 5 to 6 student groups. But I'm just not sure how many people will turn up, and so that's sort of where we're at now. I think there's among many of us, there's this feeling that we need to resist this, but we just haven't managed to develop, I think, like effective organization yet. And there's no kind of effective strategy. So I think I'll wrap up there.
Thank you so much, Katie.